The entire court fell silent when Princess Evelisse Marenval raised her hand and ordered the only man who had ever stood between her and death to leave the throne room. Captain Rowan Valehart did not move. Around them, the grand hall of Marenval glittered with candlelight and cut crystal, with silk banners hanging from the vaulted ceiling and 100 lords and ladies arranged in their finest, like painted figures in a portrait that had always known it was beautiful. The chandeliers above blazed with 300 candles. The marble floor gleamed white as fresh snow. Every surface that could be gilded had been gilded. The kingdom had dressed itself like a bride tonight, because tonight was meant to be the beginning of peace. The betrothal of Princess Evelisse to Lord Cassian Elmbrook had been announced 3 weeks prior, and the court had celebrated it as if the word itself, peace, were a feast they had been denied for years. Alliance banners hung between the windows. Wine had been poured since the 4th bell, and at the center of it all, Evelisse had stood in a gown of ivory and deep sapphire with her dark hair arranged above her head in a style the court's most senior lady had spent 3 hours perfecting, looking every inch the princess she had been raised to be. She had smiled when she was supposed to smile. She had spoken when she was supposed to speak. She had extended her hand to Lord Cassian, and he had kissed it, and the room had exhaled with pleasure. And through all of it, she had felt strangely, deeply wrong. The way a painting feels wrong when you look at it too long and begin to suspect the figure in it is not quite standing in a natural pose, not quite resting in a natural light, as though whoever rendered it had invented something that looked true without ever having seen the real thing. Rowan had watched from his position near the eastern pillar, still and silent as the stone column at his back. He always stood that way, arranged like furniture that was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. 6 years he had been her captain of guard. 6 years she had grown accustomed to the weight of his presence at her shoulder, the low certainty of his voice when he said this way, "Your Highness." The particular quality of his silence that managed to be somehow louder than other men's words. He was not handsome in the manner the court admired, which was to say he was not delicate or decorative. He was made the way working iron is made, functional, precise, built to bear force without bending. She had not looked at him for most of the evening. That was the beginning of the trouble. She should not have looked at him at all. But she had, just once, in the moment before Duchess Seraphine Valcrest rose from her place and changed the shape of the night entirely. She had looked at him, and Rowan had been watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the measured calm of a guard on duty, something older than that, something that looked very much like grief. Then the Duchess rose. Seraphine Valcrest was 55 years old, and every one of those years had been spent in service to an ambition she kept buried behind extraordinary posture, and a smile that never quite arrived in her eyes. She was the most powerful woman in the court after the Queen, a position she had built through 30 years of careful friendship with the right people and careful distance from the wrong ones. She wore black and gold tonight, and the diamond at her throat caught the light like a chip of winter sky. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. When the Duchess wished the room to hear her, the room heard her. "Your Majesty," she said, stepping forward with a sealed document raised in one gloved hand, "I am grieved to disturb the celebration, but this matter cannot wait until morning." Queen Ismeria Marenval sat upon her golden chair at the head of the hall, straight-backed and pale, a woman carved from ceremony and cold dignity. She was 48, still beautiful in the way that great architecture is beautiful, the beauty of proportion, of design, of things that endure long past the moment that made them. She looked at the Duchess, and something moved behind her eyes that Evelisse could not name. Not anger, something closer to dread. "The document, my lady?" the Queen said. "Evidence," the Duchess replied, and her voice carried an almost tender satisfaction, the way a surgeon's voice carries satisfaction at locating exactly the wound they were searching for. "Evidence that Captain Rowan Valehart of the Princess's Royal Guard has been engaged in a conspiracy to prevent the royal betrothal, that he has forged orders bearing the Queen's crest to delay the alliance envoys. that he has communicated, in secret, with enemies of the crown. The hall went quiet, in the precise way that halls go quiet when everyone in them stops breathing at the same moment. Rowan, at his pillar, did not move. His face did not change. But his eyes, Evelisse was watching him now. She could not stop. His eyes found the Queen's face and stayed there. And there was something in that look that was not a plea. It was a question. A very old, very specific question, the answer to which he seemed to already know. The Queen looked away. "Bring the document forward," said Queen Ismaria. The Duchess crossed the hall and laid the sealed letter in the Queen's hands. The Queen broke the seal. She read. She read again. Her hand, gripping the parchment, was very still. Lord Cassian, standing at Evelisse's right shoulder, leaned down to murmur something close to her ear. She heard none of it. She was watching the Queen. She was watching the way the Queen refused to look at Rowan when she lowered the letter, the way she set it carefully on the arm of her throne as though setting down something fragile. "Captain Valehart," the Queen said. "Your Majesty?" His voice was even, without inflection, as though he had prepared it that way. "You are accused of treason, of forgery, of working against the interests of this crown and this alliance." The Queen paused. "The evidence before this court is substantial. The law requires your removal from duty pending a full inquiry." "The law requires evidence beyond accusation," Rowan said. "You are given the grace of a formal trial," the Duchess said, smooth as river water over stone, "which is more grace than some would show a traitor." Evelisse had not spoken yet. She had not been able to find the place inside herself where speech lived, because it was buried beneath a cold and rising panic that she understood, dimly, with the particular clarity of things only half understood. Had nothing to do with the document. It had to do with Rowan's face. The grief she had seen there 20 minutes ago. The way the Queen would not look at him. The way the Duchess smiled as if this night had always been meant to arrive at this precise moment. But the court was watching her. Cassian was watching her. And she was the Crown Princess of Marenvale, which meant that the face she wore in public was not her own. It belonged to the kingdom. She lifted her chin. "Captain Valehart," Evelisse said, and her voice was steady, trained steady, the way a hand learns steadiness through years of practice with a needle or a pen. "You are relieved of your duty. Lay down your sword and leave my presence." She watched the words land. She had ordered him about 100 times in 6 years. Small orders. Necessary orders. "Wait here. Follow at distance. See that door is locked." He had always obeyed. He was a man built from obedience the way a cathedral is built from stone. Not because the stone had no other purpose, but because the builder had shaped it that way, and the stone had accepted the shaping. But this was not a small order. And Rowan looked at her as though the command had struck deeper than any blade. The silence stretched. Then he reached for his sword. The gasps that scattered through the hall were not dramatic. They were the sound of people genuinely frightened. That small, involuntary catch of breath when the body understands danger before the mind has finished its argument. 3 palace guards moved at once, hands at their hilts. Lord Cassian stepped smoothly in front of Evelisse, arms slightly raised. The gesture of a man protecting a woman while making very sure the room could see him doing it. "Do not do this," Evelisse whispered. Rowan drew his sword. The blade caught the candlelight and held it, a long, clean bar of light in the middle of all that silk and fear. "Seize him," the Duchess cried. But Rowan turned the blade downward, not toward the princess, not toward the court, not toward anyone. He turned the blade toward the marble floor and lowered it until its point rested between them on the white stone, and he held it there with both hands on the grip. And his knuckles were pale, and his eyes were on Evelisse alone. "I will leave," he said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, to every silk sleeve and every powdered wig and every candle and every painted face. "When they tell you why your cradle was guarded by 3 dead men, why your birth record was burned, Why the Queen has feared your birthday for 22 years. Evelisse went still. The kind of still that has nothing to do with not moving. The kind that comes from the inside, when everything that has been shifting and uncertain for as long as you can remember suddenly shifts so violently that the shaking stops simply because it does not know where to go. She heard someone near her make a small noise. She thought it was the Duchess. She looked at Seraphine Valcrest, and the woman's face, that beautiful, controlled, political face, had lost every trace of color. She looked at the Queen. Queen Ismeria's hand had closed around the arm of her throne so tightly that the veins on the back of it rose through the skin like rivers on a map. "This is madness," Lord Cassian said, very crisply. "He has drawn steel in the throne room. He should be removed by force if he will not go by reason." "Yes," said the Duchess, her voice recovered, her face very nearly recovered. "Remove him." The palace guards advanced. "My birth record," Evelisse said. Her voice came out before she had decided to speak. It stopped the room. "Did he say my birth record was burned?" she asked. She was speaking to no one in particular. She was speaking to the air, to the space between herself and Rowan, to the particular quality of silence that had fallen over the court. "Is that what he said?" "Your Highness," Cassian said, low and urgent. "He is trying to create confusion. This is exactly what a man attempting to escape accusation—" "Silence," Evelisse said. She had not spoken to Cassian that way before. The word came out very quietly and landed very hard, the way quiet words do when they carry sufficient weight behind them. Cassian fell silent. "Captain Valehart," she said, "you are surrounded by guards. You have drawn your sword in a room full of witnesses. You are about to be arrested, and I do not think I can stop it." She paused. "So say what you came to say." Rowan lifted his eyes to hers, and in his face was everything he had ever kept from her: the old loyalty, the old grief, the old and terrible love that a man carries for the truth, when he has been its keeper so long that it becomes indistinguishable from himself. "My father," he said, "was Sir Aldrin Valehart. He served as captain of the palace guard the night of your birth. He was executed 2 years later, declared a traitor, stripped of his name and rank." He paused. "He died refusing to reveal where the true infant princess had been taken." The hall, impossibly, went quieter. "I have served you for 6 years, Your Highness," Rowan continued, "not because I was assigned to guard you. Because my father used the last of his strength to write me a letter and beg me to find you and keep you alive and see to it that the truth survived long enough to reach you." "Arrest him," the Duchess said, and her voice had gone flat and cold and precise, like a blade being held very level. "Now." The guards moved. 2 of them reached Rowan and took hold of his arms, and he let them. He dropped the sword. He let them take him. He did not struggle or strike. He only looked at Evelisse as they pulled him back. "Your Highness," he said, "ask the Queen about Ardenfell." Then the palace doors slammed open. Every head in the hall turned. In the doorway, supported by a young servant girl on one side and a walking cane on the other, stood an old woman dressed in mourning black, so faded it had gone the gray of old ash. She was small and bent and white-haired, and her face was mapped with the kind of lines that come not from age alone, but from decades of careful silence that has cost the keeper enormously. In her arms, she held a bundle of cloth. She walked into the hall the way old women walk when they have long since stopped being afraid of the things that used to frighten them. Which is to say, she walked as if the room belonged to her, or more precisely, as if the room no longer had any power over her that she had not already given it and taken back. "Mistress Caldria Voss," said the Queen, very quietly, very still. Evelisse did not know the name. She looked at the Queen's face and saw that the Queen knew this woman, had not expected her, had perhaps spent years believing she would never have to see her again, and was now looking at her the way people look at things they had buried when those things return to the surface after a long rain. The old woman stopped in the center of the hall. She held out the bundle of cloth. It was a blanket. old, once white, stained with the brown red of very old blood along one corner. It had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases were built into it now, permanent as stitching. But stitching was the point. Because along the border of the blanket, in thread that had once been gold and had faded to the color of autumn leaves, there was an emblem. Evelisse did not recognize it immediately. She had to look at it twice, and then a third time, and even then it was not recognition exactly. It was something closer to the sensation of almost remembering a dream. The way a face in a dream is not a face you have ever seen, and is yet somehow intensely familiar. The emblem was not the crest of Marenval. "Where did you get that?" the queen said. She was not asking. She was barely speaking at all. The words came out of her the way words come out when the body has held them down for a very long time, and the muscles holding them down have finally failed. "I kept it," the old woman said, "as you asked me to keep the child. As I was told the child would be kept." She paused. "I waited to see if you would tell her. For 22 years I waited." She looked at Evelisse. Her eyes, dark and direct and very old, held an expression that Evelisse could not classify, something between sorrow and relief, the way a messenger looks when they finally set down a burden that has been breaking their back for a very long journey. "Now I am done waiting." "Remove them both," the Duchess said. Her voice had gone to steel. "The man, the woman, the cloth. Remove them from this hall and seal this court until morning." This court will not be sealed," Evelisse said. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. There was something in her that she had never understood, a particular quality of stillness that, when it spoke, produced a silence in others. The court had always responded to it. She had always thought it was simply the effect of royal rank, the weight of a crown in the room, even when the crown was not on her head. Now, looking at the blanket in the old woman's hands, she began to wonder what else it might be. "What is that emblem?" she asked. The old woman opened her mouth to speak. "This hearing is concluded," the Duchess said. "My mother is the queen of this court," Evelisse said evenly, "and she has not concluded it. You have no authority to close this hall, my lady, and I will have my answer." The room was very quiet. The Duchess looked at Queen Ismeria. The queen looked at the floor. The floor offered nothing. Evelisse crossed the hall herself. She walked between the lords and ladies, between the frozen servants, between the fear, and she stopped in front of Mistress Caldria Voss, and she looked at the blanket. The emblem was a tree. Not the oak of Marenval, not the rose and tower of the betrothal house, but a tall silver birch with 3 roots visible beneath it, woven in fine gold thread so old that only the shape remained. Below the tree, a crown, and below the crown, 3 words in a language Evelisse had studied in her education, but had been taught to regard as historical rather than living. She had been taught that language belonged to a dead kingdom. She looked up. "Ardenfell," she said. It was barely a breath. The words sat in the air of the hall like a stone dropped into still water, spreading rings of silence outward. The Duchess had gone still as stone. Queen Ismeria rose from her throne. "Everyone," the queen said, "will leave this hall. Now." Lord Cassian touched Evelisse's arm. She stepped away from his hand without looking at him. "Not yet," she said. "Not until someone tells me why the cradle blanket I was wrapped in at birth carries the crest of a kingdom that was supposed to have been destroyed before I was born." And for the first time in her life, Princess Evelisse stood in the throne room of Marenval and understood that the palace around her was not the shape of the truth. It was the shape of its concealment, and somewhere behind her, as the guards dragged Rowan Valehart from the hall, she heard him say, softly, only for her, "One more thing. Ask her about the nursery, Your Highness." The West Wing. The room she locked herself and has not opened since. Then the doors closed, and he was gone. The queen dismissed the court. She did it in 3 sentences, gracious, precise, final, the way she did everything that needed to be done without explanation. The nobles filed out in a silence that was, Evelisse knew, purely temporary. By morning, every corridor of the palace would carry the sound of whispered versions of tonight, growing in the retelling, acquiring details, becoming stories. That was the nature of courts. They were built from observation and speculation in equal measure, and Rowan had just handed both in abundance. But tonight, the court obeyed. The hall emptied. Mistress Caldria Voss was escorted, not roughly but firmly, to guest quarters in the east wing. The blanket went with her, tucked under her arm, and when one of the palace stewards reached for it, she held it tighter with a grip that belied her age and said nothing, and they did not try again. Evelisse was escorted to her chambers by two ladies-in-waiting, and the faint sound of the queen saying, "We will speak in the morning," in a voice that meant, "Do not speak tonight." And Evelisse, who had spent 22 years understanding exactly what the queen's silences required of her, let herself be led away. Lady Amara Thornfield was waiting in her rooms. She was sitting near the fire with a piece of needlework she had long since stopped pretending to work on. And when Evelisse entered, she rose quickly and sent the other ladies from the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew how to clear a space without appearing to. Then she closed the door and stood with her back against it, and looked at Evelisse with wide eyes that held an expression Evelisse had not seen in them before. Fear, but also something determined underneath the fear, like a spine inside soft material. "Are you all right?" Amara asked. "No," Evelisse said. She sat down. For a long moment she simply sat and looked at her own hands, which were folded in her lap and which she could not feel. The evening had installed in her a strange numbness. Not the numbness of shock exactly, but the numbness that comes when too much arrives at once, and the body decides, as a practicality, to process none of it. "They've taken him below," Amara said softly. "Captain Valehart. The cell's beneath the West Tower." "I know. Lord Cassian has been with the Duchess since the hall emptied. They've been in her private rooms for 2 hours. Evelisse looked up. "You were watching?" "I was observing," Amara said, which was a distinction she took seriously. Watching implies suspicion. Observing implies attention to one's surroundings. Evelisse almost smiled. She did not manage it, but it was close. "And what did your observations reveal?" "That they were not surprised," Amara said, "by any of it. The blanket, the old woman, Rowan's speech." She paused. Lord Cassian did not look frightened when Rowan drew his sword. He looked relieved. The numbness in Evelisse's hands receded slightly. "He was relieved," she repeated, as if it had happened the way he hoped it would. As if Rowan had done exactly what Cassian expected him to do. Amara hesitated. "I may be wrong. I am often wrong about men. But I was watching, observing, his face. And I know what relief looks like." Evelisse was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the palace grounds lay dark and still. Somewhere far below, in the West Tower, Rowan Valehart was in a cell. He had drawn his sword in the throne room and named the dead kingdom of Ardenfell before 200 nobles and a queen who had gone white as salt. Ask her about the nursery, the West Wing, the room she locked herself and has not opened since. "Amara," Evelisse said, "I need to go somewhere tonight." "I feared you would say something like that," Amara said. And then, before Evelisse could speak, "I will help you. Do not argue. I have already decided." The West Wing had not been used in longer than Evelisse had been alive. She knew this in the vague way one knows things about large houses. A background fact, unremarkable, the kind of thing you never examine because it has never needed examining. Some wings fell out of use. It has happened in old palaces. Renovation, fashion, the inexplicable preferences of previous monarchs. She had walked past the entrance to the West Corridor 100 times in her life, and given it as much thought as she gave the ornamental vases in the 4th-floor gallery. Now she stood before the corridor's iron door, with a small oil lamp in one hand and a key in the other. The key had come from Rowan. This was the thing she could not entirely set aside as she walked the darkened passage. Hours earlier, while the palace was still in an uproar over the hall, Amara had found something tucked inside a piece of cloth at the bottom of a small package addressed to her in handwriting that was not Rowan's. It was the elderly hand of Mistress Caldria Voss, left at the east servants' entrance. Inside the package was a note, 3 lines only. The captain asked me to ensure this reached the princess's hands. The key unlocks the door at the end of the west corridor. He said she would know when to use it. The key was small and old, iron gone dark with age, unremarkable except for the tiny symbol scratched into its head. A birch tree, barely visible without light, easily mistaken for a scratch. Evelisse had turned it in her fingers for an hour before she had risen and gone to the west wing. The door unlocked on the first try. The corridor beyond was cold and very still, and smelled of old wood and stone, and something else, something faintly floral, dried and faded. The ghost of lavender that had lain in sachets in old drawers for decades. Evelisse held her lamp high and walked, and the light pushed ahead of her in a small gold circle. There were 3 doors along the corridor. The first was a storage room, the door unlocked. Empty shelves and the shapes of old furniture under cloth. The second was a sitting room, also empty. Chairs draped in sheets, a cold fireplace. The third door was at the very end of the corridor. It was smaller than the others. Its frame had been carved with a pattern of leaves. Oak leaves, she thought at first. But looking more closely, she saw they were wrong for oak. The lobes were too delicate. They were birch leaves. This door was locked. But the old key opened it as simply and completely as if it had been made for no other purpose. Inside was a nursery. It was small and perfectly preserved. Not preserved in the way of a room that had been carefully maintained. There were 22 years of dust on every surface, a thick gray silence that muffled sound and made the lamplight look dim. It was preserved in the way of a room that had been sealed and forgotten. Or more precisely, a room that had been sealed and not forgotten, but never returned to, because return was impossible. A child's crib stood near the far wall, still made up, the small blankets inside gray with dust. A rocking chair faced the cold fireplace. A painted wooden horse stood in the corner on 3 remaining legs, the 4th broken, lying a few inches away. Shelves along the walls held small cloth animals and wooden toys and 2 or 3 books, the spines too faded to read. On the wall above the crib, someone had painted a mural. It was a landscape, a hillside above a river, with a city visible in the valley below, white-towered and arched. It was not any landscape Evelisse recognized. It was not the coastal cliffs of Marinvale, not the northern forests of the Elmbrook province, not any geography she had been taught to know. The style of the city in the painting was different, older, lighter, the towers more slender, the rooflines more graceful. And in the corner of the mural, so small she almost missed it, a painter's signature. Not a name, a symbol. A birch tree, 3 roots, a crown. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she turned, and on the far wall behind the rocking chair and slightly angled as though it had been turned to face the room rather than the door, she saw the portrait. It was a woman. She was young in it, perhaps 20, 22, with dark hair and dark eyes and a particular set to the mouth that was not a smile, but that suggested a woman who knew how to smile, and was choosing, in this moment, not to. She wore a gown of deep blue-gray, and at her throat was a pendant in the shape of a birch tree. Evelisse raised her lamp. She looked at the portrait. She looked at it for a long time. She had never seen a painting of this woman. She had no idea who had painted it, or why it had been placed in this nursery, or how long it had been here. But the face in the portrait was a face she recognized in the way one recognizes one's own face, not because you have studied it closely, but because you have lived in it. The same line of the jaw, the same set of the brow, the same way the eyes sat in their sockets, a little deeper than most, giving the face a quality of quiet watchfulness that people had commented on her whole life. "You have such serious eyes for a young woman," the court ladies said. The princess sees everything. At the bottom of the portrait's frame, a small plaque. The paint of the letters had flaked and faded, but she brought the lamp close and read, very carefully. Queen Evelisse of Ardenfell, 3rd year of her reign. Evelisse sat in the dusty rocking chair for a very long time. She sat and held the lamp and looked at the portrait and tried to find in herself the appropriate feeling: shock, grief, fury, disbelief, and found instead only that deep, echoing recognition that had started in the throne room when she first heard Rowan speak. The feeling of a piece finally meeting the place in the puzzle it had always been shaped for. You were loved before you were hidden. She had not known what to do with those words when he said them. She had been too frightened for him, too confused by the blanket and the crest and the look on the queen's face, to stop and sit with the specific weight of loved before you were hidden. Now, she sat with it. And she understood that the feeling she had carried her whole life, that quiet, persistent wrongness, the sense of being a stranger in a portrait of herself, was not, as she had always suspected, a deficiency in her capacity for belonging. It was information. She had felt like a stranger because she was, in one important and devastating sense, exactly that. The woman in the portrait was her mother. The kingdom on the mural wall was Ardenfell. And Ardenfell was a kingdom the history books all agreed had been razed to nothing before Evelisse was born. The massacre of Ardenfell was not ordered by a foreign enemy. It was arranged by someone inside the Marenvale court. She did not know yet who had told her this. She would understand soon that the voice in her head, the voice that delivered this sentence as though reading it, was the voice she would use in 3 days' time, when she finally found Rowan Valehart's diary inside the old chapel wall and read the last page with her hands shaking in the dark. But that was still ahead. Tonight, in the sealed nursery with its 22 years of silence, Evelisse only sat. Then she rose and extinguished the lamp and went back through the dark corridor and returned to her rooms with the key clasped in her fist. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended tension, the way weather passes before a storm. Rowan was held in the prison beneath the West Tower, pending his formal trial. Evelisse was told, by 3 separate officials on 3 separate occasions, that contact with the prisoner was forbidden pending the inquiry. She accepted these instructions with the gracious equanimity she had been schooled in since childhood. And on the 3rd night, she used the old servants' passages, the same ones she had used as a child when she snuck to the kitchens and which she had never mentioned to anyone, including Rowan, including the Queen, to descend to the lower level of the West Tower. She was not supposed to be there. The guard on the lower level was, at the midnight change, briefly absent. Amara had observed this pattern for 2 nights previous. 5 minutes. Long enough. She found Rowan in the 3rd cell. He was sitting on the stone floor with his back against the far wall and his long legs stretched in front of him. And he looked up when she approached and said, with a composure she found almost impossible to reconcile with where he was sitting, "You should not be here, Your Highness." "You should not be here," she replied. She sat on the floor outside the cell door. There was no chair, and she would not crouch because crouching implied the conversation was brief. And for a moment they simply looked at each other through the iron bars. "I found the nursery," she said. He exhaled. Not quite relief, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. "I found the portrait," she continued. "Queen Evelisse." "Yes. She looks like me." "She does." "Rowan," Evelisse said. And she used his name without the title, without the rank, which she had never done before. And it changed the texture of the air between them in a way she noticed but did not address. "Tell me everything. All of it. Not in riddles, not in hints." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I tell you, you cannot unknow it." "I already know half of it." "The half you know is the part they let survive," he said. "What I know is the part they tried to kill." A pause. "Tell me," she said. He told her what his father had written. Sir Rowan Valehart had been, 23 years ago, the most senior member of the Royal Household Guard. Not the captain, but the second officer, the man responsible for the private wing of the palace. He had been present on the night an envoy arrived from Ardenfell in the depth of winter. An envoy that was not a diplomatic delegation, but a single woman, exhausted, terrified, carrying an infant wrapped in a gold-embroidered blanket, who had ridden for 9 days to reach Marenvale, and who was barely able to stand. The woman was Mistress Caldria Voss, then young, then the nurse companion of Queen Alethene of Ardenfell. The infant was Alethene's daughter, the Princess of Ardenfell, 6 months old, alive because Mistress Caldria had carried her out of the palace through the servants' tunnels on the night the massacre began, and ridden without stopping until Marenvale was in sight. The massacre, Aldrin had written, was the end of everything good in Ardenfell. The queen was killed in her own throne room. The king had died 3 months before, of illness. The council was dismantled. The city was burned. What the history books called a foreign invasion, a neighboring kingdom pressing its claim, had the unmistakable shape, in Aldrin's view, of something planned from the inside. Too coordinated, too precise, too targeted at the royal line and the line only, leaving the city intact enough to be useful once new hands held it. He had written, "I do not know who carried the knife. I know that the knife was directed." The infant princess arrived in Marenvale without a name, without papers, without a kingdom. Queen Ismaria, who had recently lost her own child in the 3rd month of pregnancy, a loss kept from the court, made a choice. The lost Ardenfell infant would become the Princess of Marenvale. Aldrin had helped arrange it. He had helped conceal the records. He had helped seal the nursery, remove the evidence, ensure Mistress Caldria was settled quietly in a small estate to the east. He had done all of this because Queen Ismaria had told him that it was the only way to protect the infant from the people who had ordered Ardenfell's destruction. People who would reach across borders if they knew she had survived. He had believed her. For 2 years he had believed her. Then the Duchess of Valcrest had come to him quietly, privately, and told him that she knew everything, and that she required his continued silence, and that she had friends in high places who could arrange, if necessary, for his silence to become permanent. Aldrin had refused. He had been arrested 3 weeks later on charges of falsifying royal records, charges that were, strictly speaking, accurate, though they omitted entirely the reason the records had been falsified. He had been stripped of his rank, stripped of his name, and executed. He had not, before his death, told the Duchess where the infant princess was hidden, because by the time of his arrest, he had understood that the Queen and the Duchess were not operating from the same set of interests. The Queen wanted the child hidden for protection. The Duchess wanted the child found for very different reasons. Reasons that had to do, Aldrin suspected, with control. "He left me the diary," Rowan said quietly, "and the sword. He left them to my mother, who hid them. She told me when I was old enough to understand. And then she died. And I came to the palace and I requested the post." He paused. "I had to know that you were safe." Evelisse was looking at him. In the dim light of the prison corridor, his face was all angles and shadow, and she was aware, not for the first time, but with a particular clarity she could not dismiss, of the weight of 6 years laid over what he had just told her. 6 years of standing at her shoulder. 6 years of this way, Your Highness, and I will see to it, and you are safe. Your father died so that I would live, she said. My father died because some truths are worth dying for. He paused. He did not die unhappily. I want you to know that. He wrote that he was not afraid. He wrote that the child was safe, and that was enough. She could not speak for a moment. Your family name was destroyed for my sake, she said finally. For the truth's sake. Rowan, there is more, he said. I'm sorry, there is still more. She steadied herself. Tell me. 2 nights ago, Rowan said, Lord Cassian came to this cell. She had not known this. She felt the information land in her chest with a cold, specific weight. He came alone, Rowan continued. Late, without guards. He told me that he had the means to arrange my release, to ensure the trial found in my favor, to restore my rank, to restore my family name. He paused. In exchange for permanent silence. My word, sworn, that I would never speak of any of it again. And your answer? I said no. She had known he would say no. She had known it before she asked. But the simplicity of it, the two words, the quiet finality, still struck her somewhere she had not expected to be struck. He told me something before he left, Rowan continued. I think he told me to frighten me, or to hurt you, if you ever found out. His voice had gone very even. He said that once the wedding was concluded, he and the Duchess intended to ensure that your position would become ceremonial, that the true governing power would be administered through the ducal council, that you would be given comfort and kept presentable, but removed from all actual authority. He paused. He used the word quietly. He said it would happen quietly, and that no one would notice until it had already been done. The silence between them was very complete. I see, Evelisse said. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, she paused. Are you afraid? He considered the question seriously, which was, she had always known, one of the things she valued most about him. He never dismissed questions. Of dying, no, he said. Of failing to see the truth heard, yes, very much. She rose from the floor. She brushed the stone dust from her skirts, which was a habit, an automatic gesture, something to do with her hands, while the rest of her arranged the weight of everything she now knew. I will not let them execute you, she said. Your Highness, I will not let them silence you, she said. Or my mother's memory, or your father's name. She paused at the bars. Will you trust me for 3 more days? He looked at her through the iron with an expression she could not name, except that it was the opposite of distant. It was the opposite of restrained. It was the expression of a man looking at something he has protected for a very long time and suddenly understanding that the protection has not been entirely without feeling. I have trusted you since before you could walk, he said. She went back through the servants' passage. She found the diary the following evening. The chapel was the oldest part of the palace, a small stone room off the east corridor that had been there before the rest of the palace had been built around it. The walls were thick and cold and covered in worn carvings, and the floor was uneven, and the whole space smelled of beeswax and centuries of quiet. Evelisse had always liked it. It was the only part of the palace that felt genuinely old, genuinely itself, unimproved by renovations and the court's endless appetite for modernity. Rowan had told her, in the prison corridor, that his father had hidden the diary and certain documents in the chapel, in the space behind the third stone to the left of the altar base, which was loose and had been loose for 40 years, and which the palace maintenance had never gotten around to fixing. The stone was loose. Behind it was a package wrapped in oilskin, tied with cords so old and dry it snapped when she touched it. Inside the oilskin, a small book, leather-covered, the pages brown and soft with age. A folded letter. And at the bottom, a flat object in a separate cloth, which turned out to be a document, a real one, not forged, bearing the seal of the royal house of Ardenfell, dated 23 years ago, written in a hand she would never know, but which had been Queen Alethine's, acknowledging that in the event of her death, the guardianship of her daughter and heir was placed with the household of Marenval under conditions of secrecy and protection. She sat in the chapel, and she read. She read the whole diary, or as much of it as she could in the candlelight. And it was everything Rowan had described, written in the neat, disciplined hand of a man who had been precise in all things. Precise in his observations, precise in his facts, careful to note dates and names and places, careful to distinguish between what he knew and what he suspected. She found the sections about the night of Evelisse's arrival. She found the sections about Seraphine's threats. She found the record of his arrest, and at the very end of the diary, the last entry, made 4 days before his execution, she found what Rowan had not yet told her. Aldrin had written, "I am not able to prove to a court what I know in my bones to be true. But I write it here, in the only record I have left, so that it is not only in my body when they take it from me." The fall of Ardenfell was not an accident of war. The documents I have seen, taken from the Duchess's private correspondence by a palace steward who came to me in fear after I was arrested, and which I have verified against other evidence, confirm that the order to destabilize the Ardenfell court, to arrange the removal of the king's advisors, to open the city gates on the night of the massacre, came from within Marenvale. From someone who stood to gain control of both kingdoms through the chaos of grief and war. Someone who knew that if the old alliances fell, new ones could be built in their place, built in her own image, controlled by her own hands. Duchess Seraphine Valcrest, she did not throw the first torch, she placed it. And she placed it because she knew that Ardenfell's queen had a daughter, and that the daughter was the only bloodline standing between the Duchess and the political architecture she had spent 30 years building. I have sealed the signet ring, the ring that proves Evelisse's identity to any court that holds the registry of Ardenfell's royal line, inside the hilt of my sword. I bequeath the sword to my son in the hope that he is better than I was at surviving the people who deserve to be outlived. If you are reading this, if my son has placed this in your hands as I have asked him to, then you are either the princess herself or someone who loves her. Either way, you have more courage than I had. Use it. Evelisse sat in the old chapel for a long time after she finished reading. Then she folded the diary carefully, wrapped it back in its oilskin, and held it against her chest. She was the daughter of Queen Alethene of Ardenfell. She was the surviving heir of a murdered bloodline. She had been hidden in Marenvale by a woman who was not her mother, but who had, in the only way available to her, chosen to protect her at a cost she was still carrying. She had been surrounded her whole life by a lie that was also, in the strange and painful way of human things, a form of love. And the woman who had ordered her kingdom's destruction, who had spent 22 years eliminating every witness and every piece of evidence, who had arranged this betrothal specifically to finalize control over the prize she had been building toward for 3 decades. That woman was sleeping 50 meters away in the finest rooms in the palace. Evelisse rose. She blew out the candle. She walked back through the dark palace with the diary in her hands and 3 days of fury in her chest, very quiet, very cold, and entirely decided. The trial of Captain Rowan Valehart was set for the 5th morning after his arrest. The Duchess had insisted on the formal proceedings. This was, Evelisse had come to understand, a deliberate choice. Not because the Duchess believed in formal proceedings, but because she believed in audiences. A private removal was a rumor. A public execution was a lesson. And what the Duchess wished to teach the court through the vehicle of Rowan's death was simple. Those who know too much do not outlive the knowing. The throne room was full again. This time it held not the festive crowd of the betrothal ceremony, but the sober, tense gathering of a court that had been awake and frightened for 5 days and had come to the trial the way people come to things they fear but cannot stop watching. Drawn by dread, held by the knowledge that whatever happened next would be definitive. Rowan was brought in by 4 guards. He wore the plain gray clothes of a prisoner, his rank insignia removed, his sword gone. He had clearly not slept well, and there was a pallor beneath his usual composure, but the composure itself was intact. He stood in the center of the hall with the same still, contained quality he always carried, as though the stones of his character had been set too deep to dislodge by ordinary external pressure. He looked for Evelisse. She was standing in her place, at the right of the throne, in a gown of dark blue, with her hair down and simply arranged, without jewels. She had dressed this way deliberately, not for mourning, but for clarity. She wanted nothing between her face and the room. He found her, and she gave him one small, fractional nod, which carried everything it needed to carry. He understood. She saw his shoulders settle fractionally. He turned back to face the Duchess, who stood at the center of the hall with the letter of accusation in her hands and the confidence of a woman who had never, in 30 years of court life, lost the room in a confrontation she had arranged. This court meets today to hear the formal charges of treason, forgery, and sedition against one Rowan Valehart, formerly captain of the princess's royal guard, said the palace herald. The accuser is Duchess Seraphine Valcrest. The accused may speak in his own defense following the presentation of evidence. Let us proceed, said the Duchess. And she began. She was very good. Evelisse could acknowledge this, even now. The Duchess laid the forged correspondence before the court in perfect order, spoke about it with the measured gravity of someone who took no pleasure in the proceedings, but was driven by obligation, referenced precedent and law and the particular danger of treachery within the household guard. She was thorough. She was precise. She was, if you did not know what Evelisse now knew, entirely convincing. Lord Cassian sat near the front of the court and watched the proceedings with the face of a man who has every reason to be satisfied. The prisoner manipulated the princess, the Duchess concluded, through the exploitation of his access and the fabrication of alarming false claims in order to disrupt the royal marriage and serve his own interests. This court has seen the evidence. I ask that it render a verdict consistent with the clarity of the facts before it. She stepped back. The accused may speak, said the herald. Rowan turned to the room. He was about to speak when Evelisse stepped forward. I will speak first, she said. The Duchess turned. Lord Cassian straightened. Queen Ismeria, seated on her throne, went very still. Your Highness, said the herald uncertainly. This is a formal proceeding. Yes, Evelisse said. I am aware. I am also the princess whose guard stands accused of manipulating her, which would seem to give me a reasonable interest in the proceedings. She paused. I will speak. Now. The herald looked at the Queen. The Queen, after a moment, inclined her head. Evelisse stepped into the center of the hall. She had planned what she was going to say. She had planned it in the 3 nights since the prison corridor, had arranged it carefully, had thought about the order and the weight and the timing. She had the diary in her hands. She had Amara on her left, composed and pale, holding a sealed leather case of correspondence. She had Mistress Caldria Voss at the back of the room, seated in a chair that had been quietly arranged for her. She had one more thing. She would get to it. I stand before this court as the daughter of the House of Marinvale, she began. I have been raised in this palace, educated in this court, prepared for the rule of this kingdom. I have been obedient to the requirements of my position because I was taught that obedience was peace. She paused. I have recently learned that this is not always true. Sometimes obedience is only a prettier word for captivity. She heard Rowan, very quietly, exhale. 5 days ago, Captain Valehart drew his sword in this throne room and was immediately branded a traitor. He drew his sword to protect me, not from external danger, but from the danger of marrying into a plan that was not a peace alliance, but a political seizure. She turned to face Cassian. Lord Cassian Elmbrook, in the presence of this court and with this formal accusation. You visited Captain Valehart in the prison, beneath the West Tower 3 nights past. You offered him his freedom in exchange for permanent silence regarding my identity and the circumstances of my birth. You told him that, after our marriage, my authority would be reduced to ceremony, while you and the Duchess governed in practice. You used the word quietly. She paused. I was in the passage behind his cell. I heard every word. Cassian's face went, in the space of 2 seconds, through several changes that were individually informative. This is, he began. Lady Thornfield, Evelisse said. Amara stepped forward and opened the leather case. These are letters recovered from the Duchess's private correspondence, Evelisse said. They outline, in specific detail, the arrangement between Lord Cassian and the Duchess of Valcrest. The plan to accelerate the marriage. The plan to use it to consolidate ducal control over the crown. The plan to, once I had served my purpose as a legitimizing figure, ensure that I was... She looked at the letters, then at the room. The word used in the 3rd letter, is retired from active governance. She looked at the Duchess. My lady, would you like to tell the court what that phrase means in practice? Or shall I? Those letters are fabrications, the Duchess said. Her voice was very level. It was the voice of someone who has handled accusations before and who is accustomed to surviving them. I do not know what arrangement the princess thinks she has uncovered, but she has been manipulated by a man whose sole purpose has been to destabilize. Mistress Voss, Evelisse said. The old woman rose from her chair. The room watched her walk forward. She walked slowly and with great dignity, and when she reached the center of the hall, she stopped and looked at the Duchess. And the look she gave her contained 22 years of a silence that had been kept at very high cost. My name is Caldria Voss, she said. I was nurse companion to Queen Alathine of Ardenfell. I carried Her Majesty's daughter out of the burning palace on the night of the massacre, with the Queen's own blessing and her own blood on my hands. I rode 9 days to Marenvale and placed the infant into the care of Her Majesty Queen Ismeria, with the document Queen Alathine had sealed before the massacre began. She paused. I have kept this secret for 22 years because I was told the child's life depended upon it. I am no longer keeping it because the child is a woman grown and she deserves to stand in her own name. She turned to Evelisse. You are the daughter of Queen Alathine of Ardenfell, she said. I carried you from the fire. The court made a sound that was not quite any one thing. Not gasp, not cry, not murmur, but the composite sound of 200 people comprehending something that fundamentally reorganizes everything they thought they understood. Your Majesty, Evelisse said. She turned to the Queen. The Queen looked at her. In all of Evelisse's life, she had never been able to read her mother's, Queen Ismeria's, face with any certainty. The Queen was too composed, too controlled, too much the practitioner of the public face. But in this moment, in front of the entire court, with 22 years of secrecy finally released into the open air, the control was simply no longer available. What was on Ismeria's face was grief. Not guilt alone, though there was guilt. Not fear, though there was fear. Grief. The specific, irreducible grief of a woman who has spent 2 decades loving a child she could not claim and protecting a truth she could not speak. I did not give you life, Evelisse, the Queen said. Her voice was very quiet but entirely clear. But I gave my soul to keep yours from being taken. She rose from the throne. She rose, and in front of the full court, she said, I took the infant princess of Ardenfell into this house as my own daughter. I destroyed the records to protect her life. I have known, every day since, that I was holding a truth that was not mine to hold forever. She paused. The time for holding it is over. The Duchess moved. Not quickly. There was nowhere to go. But she moved the way people move when they are refusing to accept what the room is doing. Stepping forward, hand raised, voice fully restored to its authority. A kingdom cannot be ruled by a girl with no name, she said. The princess is legitimate heir of nothing. She is the orphan of a conquered state, placed here by deception, raised by fraud. This court has no obligation to. Then listen carefully while I speak mine. Evelisse's voice was very quiet. The Duchess stopped. My name, Evelisse said, is the daughter of Queen Alathine of Ardenfell and the ward of Queen Ismeria of Marenvale. My claim to the throne of this kingdom rests on 2 decades of lawful succession in this court. My claim to the rights of Ardenfell rests on blood. She paused. But the final proof does not rest in words. She turned. Captain Valehart. Rowan stepped forward. The guards who held him loosened their grip, not because anyone instructed them to, but because the room had shifted and they could feel it, and their hands loosened with it. Your father left you a sword, Evelisse said. He did. Where is the sword now? Rowan reached into the plain gray prison clothes he wore and removed a knife. The guard who had brought him in had searched him, but had not found the small blade concealed in the lining of the boot, which Amara had arranged. And he looked at Evelisse one more time, a look that asked and confirmed at once. and then he raised it. "The hilt," he said to the court. My father sealed something inside the hilt. He applied the blade to the seam of the grip. The sword itself had been brought to the hall as evidence, and was resting on the evidence table at the room's edge. And with the clean, precise movement of a man who has thought about this moment for many years, he worked the false interior of the grip free. The hilt fell open. Inside, sealed in wax and wrapped in a fragment of leather so old it had almost no color, was a ring. A signet ring. Gold, set with a dark stone, engraved with a birch tree. Rowan set it on the table before the court. "The royal signet of Ardenfell," he said. "Registered in the archives of 3 allied kingdoms. My father placed it there 21 years ago, before his execution, to ensure that if I ever found the princess, if I ever stood where I am standing now, there would be no question left to answer." The court looked at the ring. The Duchess looked at the ring, and then she looked at Rowan, and her eyes held something that was almost, not quite, but almost, respect for the sheer persistence of the thing she had spent decades trying to prevent. "My father," Rowan said, turning to the full court, "was declared a traitor by this crown and executed for crimes he did not commit. He was convicted of falsifying royal records. What he had done, in truth, was help conceal an innocent infant from the people who ordered her mother's murder." He paused. "I ask this court to hear his name today and render it innocent. Not for my sake. For the sake of a man who died with his honor intact and was not permitted to keep his name. It fell apart after that, in the way large structures fall. Not at once, but progressively, each element withdrawing its support until what remains can no longer stand. Cassian tried first to discredit the letters, then to challenge Mistress Caldria's account, then to argue procedurally. He was very accomplished at argument. But the room had turned, in the particular way that rooms turn when enough truth has entered them, that the people in them can feel the difference. The air changes, the light changes, the particular quality of attention changes from suspended judgment to decided conclusion. Lord Cassian Elmbrook's betrothal to Princess Evelisse was dissolved by formal declaration before the noon bell. The Duchess of Valcrest was stripped of her title and placed under arrest on charges of sedition, conspiracy to commit treason, and complicity in the massacre of Ardenfell, charges that would take months to fully prosecute, but which were, in the immediate moment, simply the formal container for what everyone in the room already knew. Cassian, attempting to leave through the side door, found Rowan, freed now, uncuffed. His sword returned to him, standing between him and the door with an expression of absolute professional impassivity. "My lord," Rowan said pleasantly, "the door is behind you." They waited for the palace guard to take him. And then, in the hush that followed, the particular hush of a room in which something enormous has just finished and no one quite knows where to put their hands, Queen Ismeria looked at Evelisse from across the room. "I did not lie to you to harm you," the queen said. "I want you to know that. Whatever you feel about what was done, I want you to know that." Evelisse was quiet for a moment. She thought about the sealed nursery, the portrait, the painted city on the wall that she had never known was her city. She thought about all the birthdays she had felt the queen watching her with that particular strange expression. Not quite maternal, not quite cold, something in between. Something she had spent years trying to interpret and failing. She understood it now. It was the expression of a woman watching someone else's child, whom she had loved long enough that the distinction no longer felt simple. "I know," Evelisse said. "It does not make it smaller, but I know." The queen nodded once, very slight, very precise. "Then I am glad," she said. The court restored Sir Rowan Valehart's name before the afternoon bell. It was done formally, by herald, in the language of official declarations, which is always slightly less than what the moment deserves, but which is, practically speaking, all that the law affords. The name was removed from the traitor's roll. The rank was posthumously restored. The record was amended. A document was prepared for signing. Rowan stood in the center of the hall and heard his father's name spoken innocent, and he did not make any sound or change any expression. But the quality of his stillness changed in a way that Evelisse, watching from a few feet away, recognized as something being finally set down after a long time carrying. She went to him after. Not immediately. There was still the court to manage, the declarations to complete, the arrested to process, the stunned noble houses to gently reassure, the enormous practical architecture of an afternoon in which everything changed. But eventually, by the early evening, the hall had emptied enough. She went to him. He was standing near the eastern pillar, which was where he always stood. Old habits. "Captain Valehart," she said. "Your Highness?" He made the small, formal gesture of acknowledgement that 6 years of guarding had made automatic. She shook her head. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I want you to stand with me and not below me." He looked at her. "I want to show you something," she said. "If you will come." The chapel was quiet. They walked to it through the empty corridors as the evening settled over the palace, and the only sound was their footsteps on the old stones and somewhere outside the thick chapel walls. The distant sound of the city beginning to understand that something had changed at the center of its world. Evelisse lit the candle at the altar. The small space filled with warm gold light, and the old carvings on the walls emerged from the shadows. The worn faces and foliated borders, and the history of the stone itself, older than everything that had been built around it. She sat in the pew, and Rowan sat beside her. Not in front of her, not behind her, not at a respectful standing distance. And for a while neither of them spoke. "What was she like?" Evelisse said finally. "My mother." "Did your father write about her?" "He wrote that she was not afraid," Rowan said. That was what struck him. He wrote that he expected a woman fleeing with an infant to be terrified, and she was not. She was, he used the word, decided, as if she had already made her peace with what was happening, and all that remained was to make sure you were safe before it finished. Evelisse absorbed this. "She sent you to me," she said. "In a way. She set everything in motion that eventually brought you to this palace." "Yes. She arranged for you to be the one guarding me." "Yes." "That seems," Evelisse said slowly, "like a great deal of trust to place in a letter." "It does," Rowan agreed. "But my father trusted it. And I chose to." He paused. "I could have done something else with my life. I considered it. The circumstances of my father's death were not exactly an advertisement for palace service." The faintest trace of dryness in his voice, which she had learned years ago to hear as his version of a smile. "But the alternative was spending my life knowing you were here, and not knowing if you were safe, and that I found I couldn't do that." She was looking at the altar. "You were ordered to guard my life," she said. "No," he said. "I was ordered to guard your truth." She turned to look at him. In the chapel candlelight, he was all warmth and shadow, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her that first moment in the throne room, before the night broke open. The old expression, the one she had not recognized then, that she understood now for exactly what it was. Not grief alone, not duty alone. Something that had grown, very quietly, over 6 years of silence and protection and the particular intimacy of a man who knows when you are afraid before you know it yourself. It was love. It had always been love. He did not say so. He was too precise for it. Too aware of the gap that still existed between his position and hers. Too deeply schooled in the habits of restraint that had kept them both alive, and the truth breathing long enough to reach this room. But it was in his face, without concealment, for the first time. "I am the daughter of a murdered queen," Evelisse said. "I am the ward of a living one. I am the heir of a kingdom that was destroyed and the presumptive ruler of a kingdom that is still standing. And in a few months, I will have to decide what to do with both of those things, and a court full of frightened nobles and a peace alliance that has just dissolved." She paused. "I am about to have a very complicated future." "Yes," he said. "I should like not to face it alone." A pause. "You have Lady Thornfield," he said. "And the Queen." "Yes," she said. "And I want you." The silence that followed was very full. "Not as my guard," she said. "You have been my guard long enough. I want you to stand beside me as the man who gave me back my name." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he bowed his head. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, not stopping him this time, just there, steady, and said, "Not that either. Just..." She took his hand. His hand was warm, and she could feel the calluses on his palm from years of sword work. And he looked at her hand in his with an expression she could not name and would not try. "There is a great deal of work ahead," she said. "Yes." "And we cannot simply..." She paused. "There are protocols. There are houses that will object. There are laws about..." "Evelisse," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he had said her name. Simply her name, without title, without rank, in a voice that was entirely his own. "I know," he said. She exhaled. "We have time," she said. "We have time," he agreed. They sat in the old chapel as the candle burned, and outside the palace the city was waking to a new version of itself. And inside the palace the court was absorbing the shape of a day that had broken everything and reassembled it differently. On the table near the altar, Rowan Valehart's diary lay in its old oilskin cover, its work complete. The royal signet of Ardenfell was, at that moment, being formally catalogued by the palace archivist. Duchess Seraphine Valcrest was in a cell in the East Tower, a finer cell than the one they had put Rowan in, because rank persists even in its disgrace, but a cell nonetheless. Lord Cassian was somewhere on the road south, escorted by palace guards to his family's estate pending the formal proceedings that would follow. And in the throne room, where it had all begun, the gold chair stood empty in the candlelight. 3 days later, Evelisse stood before the full court again. This time she stood at the center alone, without accusation, without crisis, without an enemy prepared to destroy her. The court arranged around her wore expressions ranging from solemn to relieved to the particular cautious attentiveness of people who have learned, very recently, that the world contains more than they thought. She spoke for a long time. She spoke about Ardenfell, and about Marenvale, and about the particular responsibility of a ruler who holds 2 inheritances, one of blood and one of love, and must decide what to build from both. She spoke about her mother, Queen Alethene, whose name she had not known until 5 days ago, and which she intended to add to the royal memorial in the chapel. She spoke about Queen Ismeria, who sat in her golden chair with a face that was not quite composed but was trying to be, and whom Evelisse addressed with the title of mother, because whatever else was true, the word still fit. She spoke briefly about Sir Rowan Valehart, and the court was asked to rise in acknowledgement of his name, and it did. At the end of her address, she turned to Rowan, who was standing, of course, near the eastern pillar. "Captain Valehart has been reinstated," she said to the court. "His family name has been restored. He will continue in service to the crown." She paused. "In whatever capacity we determine together." It was a small thing to say. The court would interpret it various ways. Evelisse had decided she did not particularly mind the interpreting. Rowan, from his pillar, looked at her with those grave, steady eyes. She held his gaze for 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned back to the room. Outside, the afternoon light was coming in through the palace's high windows, laying long gold bars across the white marble floor. Dust moved in the light the way it always does, tiny and purposeless and beautiful. The court had begun to disperse, the particular organized shuffle of 200 people redistributing after a formal address, and the room filled with the quiet sound of movement and murmured conversation. Evelisse stood at the center of the gold light and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was standing in the right place. Not because the marble was familiar, though it was. Not because the banners were hers, though they were. Because she was standing in her own name. The full name, the real one. The name that had 2 parts and 22 years of silence behind it. and one evening of candlelight in a chapel ahead of it, and a great deal of complicated and uncertain and necessary future beyond that. She was the daughter of Queen Elithene of Ardenfell. She was the ward of Queen Ismeria of Marinvale. She was nobody's political convenience. She was nobody's quietly retired ceremonial figure. She was nobody's lie. And as the court bowed, not to the princess they had shaped, but to the woman they had failed to destroy, she felt the particular and irreplaceable satisfaction of a truth that has been drawn like a sword. It was drawn now. And as any soldier knows, a sword that has been truly, finally drawn, with full purpose and full commitment and the full weight of what it means behind it, that sword does not go back into the sheath unchanged. It goes back different. Or it does not go back at all. She was loved before she was hidden. He was loyal before he was allowed to say so. And the truth, as it always does, outlived the silence.